Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And I could sense from the muttering about gold open access, we're going to have a lively session. So let me start by trying to get you, as the audience, on side by saying that Britain can be very proud of the quality of its research and scientific endeavour, using science in its broadest sense, Wissenschaft, research and knowledge across all the different disciplines. And a crucial part of the ecosystem, which makes us so creative and vibrant, is indeed our systems for information retrieval and storage and exchange. And a book that really brought this home to me, which many of you will be familiar with, was a book tackling that great puzzle of the economic historians, why Britain had the Industrial Revolution, why it happened here. And of course, that's a debate that's been going on for decades and will carry on. And this book by Joel Mokyr, The Gifts of Athena, argues that one reason, a crucial reason why we had the Industrial Revolution, was that we had a better network of learned societies, publications, both professional publications and also magazines and newspapers and local groups, which meant we had a more efficient system of transmitting information when an innovation was working and having an effect than any previous society had had. And you can see, obviously, it's an argument shaped by our understanding of the significance of the information economy today. And I think that, therefore, the quality of how we handle and transmit information is absolutely crucial to the success and vibrancy of our research effort. And academic publishing and the preservation of data in research libraries is a crucial part of that. Now, as you heard in the introduction, I got particularly involved in this a few years back as minister, and I'm no longer the minister, no longer have any responsibility for government policy, so what I say isn't government policy, but I can still remember back in 2011 a really uncomfortable, unproductive meeting at BIS when we started trying to get some kind of conversation going about open access. And there are, of course, different interests and different views from the academic community itself, people like yourselves from libraries, the publishers, and I was trying to find a way forward. And it was after that unsatisfactory meeting and then taking some soundings about what we should do that I invited Janet Finch to produce her excellent report that, as you said, came out in 2012. And that report continues to have significance. And many of you will have seen Adam Tickell's recent update and review, which he submitted to Joe Johnson. And indeed, Joe replied only last month, basically endorsing the points that Adam had made, and Adam in turn very much drawing on the Janet Finch agenda. So my impression, as I said, no longer minister, but my impression is that what Janet was trying to do and that framework she laid out is still indeed very much endorsed and welcomed by the government, and I'm pleased about that. And for me personally, I always was a believer and I remain a believer in the gold access agenda. It seems to me that an illegitimate part of a research budget is paying for the communication of the findings of the research, and it's more efficient for all of us if those publicly funded findings are available as quickly as possible. Taxpayers are entitled to expect that, and I don't want them hidden behind paywalls if you can avoid that, if at all possible. And gold is the direct, open, straightforward way of recognizing all that. Now, I'm a realist, resources are limited, publishers and others were not going to go straight away to gold access, so of course there's also a role for green, and the decision tree that was developed a few years back brings that out, and as I understand it, that decision tree remains in operation. So that's my particular view about how it should all be done. It was always controversial. There are different views. One argument, which I remember participating in, is if we make this move as the UK, is there a first mover advantage or disadvantage? And of course you can argue that there's a disadvantage. You end up basically, let's put it very crudely, giving the Chinese all your research for free, and their work is stuff you have to pay for. So is there a dangerous asymmetry? And I recognise that risk and that issue. On the other hand, if Britain wants to have a role of influencing the debate and a role in thought leadership, I thought our moving and then urging others to do the same was a good place to be. I welcome the way in which the Dutch, who've currently got the EU presidency, are putting open access on the agenda themselves, and they were always very supportive of what we were doing. And actually, and I was looking up the figures, Britain is not a massive outlier. We have got, at the moment, 19% of research publications out under gold and 8% under green. For the rest of the world, it's 17% gold and 6% green. So it's not as if we have got some extraordinary experiment that is a massive divergence from the rest of the world. And I do think that there is still, the world is heading in the direction of a mixture of gold and green. Another tricky issue, and you involved in research libraries will be very aware of this, is hybrid journals and arrangements for payment and the extent to which and the danger that you find yourself paying twice, both paying for publication through gold systems and then paying to subscribe to journals. And there's I think in Joe's response to Adam Tickell's report, there is a hint of continued pressure on publishers to ensure that there is a fair deal there and people do not find themselves paying twice, and I very much support that. So there are tricky issues, and I would say thirdly on my list, after the issue of whether we are somehow setting ourselves apart from the rest of the world, and also the hybrid journals issue, there's the responsibilities that you have for ensuring that open access material is properly curated and genuinely is open access, and that's another big challenge for your profession, which I'm sure you have been discussing during your conference. So that's kind of where we are in the near term of that specific debate that I launched 5 years ago. But let me now take a few steps back and look at some of the wider themes that are, I think, still very relevant and going to become increasingly so for people in the research community. I would say that increasingly it's recognized that you don't just need open access for the publication of the academic article, you need access to the data behind the article, and you need access to the code or the systems that we use to interpret that data. And I remember one of my kind of trick questions to scientists, I would say to them, is the data and the software you've written for analyzing that data, is that a fundamental part of an open system of sharing research findings, or is that the most precious IP that you possess, which is going to end up as your pension fund? To which they would say, yes, both. And that issue is one that you must wrestle with every day. And I'm absolutely clear that it's, as well as the results, people have to be able to access the data behind the results and in an intelligible, usable way. And that, again, comes with a cost. That curation and access to data is not a free service, and it's one of the reasons why the journals would argue that they add value by helping to curate the data behind the papers that they publish. And similarly, universities paying for the publication of research through gold schemes in particular have that responsibility. And that plays into an issue that I gather you were talking about in the previous session, and I'm sorry to have missed that, about reproducibility. And I do think that the research community has to recognize that this is becoming a very significant issue now. Now, I understand that science is a complicated process. You don't just get one set of findings that suddenly clinch every issue. But the reproducibility of results and making them available so that people can rise to that challenge is incredibly important. And we all know, and I gather again it was what was being talked about in the previous session, there are very strong rewards for publishing exciting new results that show things that could work or be effective, or drugs that might work, or exciting new findings. And there is a very strong bias towards positive results. I'm very aware of this because I have just left a profession which I was engaged in for over 20 years of politics, where there is a very strong bias towards publishing negative results. And I always used to say to scientists, imagine that you couldn't get anyone interested in one of your experiments that yields a good positive result, but pages and pages of journals were full of everything you'd done that hadn't worked. It would be a completely different environment. Of course, people say science needs a journal of negative results, and I say newspapers every day are politicians' journal of negative results. And so there's a fascinating contrast. And it's one of the things that keeps us up to the mark and keeps politicians aware that we know that anything that doesn't work is going to be absolutely scrutinized, and we're going to call before select committees and going to get lots of coverage, and so it should. I think scientists get it pretty easy, to be honest, with this focus on the experiments that have worked and the veil that is drawn over everything that doesn't work. And we do need more scope and more recognition, and we need mechanisms that ensure that that kind of research that disproves things, challenges things, or just simply doesn't reach a successful finding is also given weight. And I had an excellent team of private secretaries during my time as a minister, and many of them had a background in academia, and one of them had done a doctorate in biological sciences at Cambridge, and after that doctorate she had come over and joined the civil service and was in my private office. And I remember saying to her, so why did you give up on your academic career? And she said, well, I was researching this molecule that we thought might help with some aspect of cancer, and it didn't work. So my doctorate was about a molecule that hadn't worked. And so that I wasn't really going to be able to make an academic career. And I thought a system where the gamble that you play at the age of 23 or 24, whether you get the molecule right or wrong, for whether or not it was going to have an impact on cancer, had affected her ability to have a long-term research career, was quite an odd way of arranging, well, evidence of the incentives you have in your research careers. And I think it is a challenge for science and research. So there is a genuine issue about reproducibility and ensuring that there is access to the data behind findings. A few other things where I think we can be excited about the prospects, but we need to make sure that we get the regime right. In social science and social policy, the surge in data, what's even been called, I think, by one excited analyst from MIT, social physics. I think the capacity to use data to understand changes in society is where, to be honest, I think British social science has lagged behind, but I hope that as we make it easier to access data and to link data, we advance. Let me give you an example from a subject I'm very interested in, social mobility. Raj Chetty in the US analyzes millions of data points to track social mobility in the US. He can tell you 5% of American dentists come from Illinois. He can tell you schools that have surges in performance are getting people through to leading universities and then fall back. He can track people through into the jobs market, through school and university and on into their tax and their incomes via their tax records. Of course, all with proper protection, anonymity, confidentiality and everything. But he has got the mechanisms for linking that data, which really informs the debate on social mobility in the US. In Britain, for the last 10 years, going right back to some research publications at the beginning of the millennium, our debate on social mobility has been by comparing the 1958 and 1970 cohort studies, each of which had a low tens of thousands of participants, two snapshots in time, and saying children from the least affluent 20% of households in 1970 enjoyed rather less mobility than children from the poorest 20% of households in 1958. That was basically it. And 2 points don't even make, the rigorous academics here would say 2 points don't even make a trend. But when you hear politicians saying social mobility is falling in Britain, it's essentially that single finding from two data sets, quite small, from two snapshot points in time, literally people born in a week in 1958 and people born in a week in 1970 is what they're referring to. That is a very fragile database compared with the way in which the debate in the US is conducted. And we have been very bad, and I take responsibility for this, and I remember the discussions where we edged things forward. It's not at all easy to link the data from schools and the pupil database, from FE colleges, from UCAS about who's applying to where, from HESA, the Higher Education Statistics Agency, on how people are doing at university, and then on out into the labour market through the labour force survey and HMRC data on tax receipts. Now, we can see what might be possible, but getting there is incredibly hard. And we have made progress. We've changed the law to make it easier to link those data sets than before, and there are secure administrative data centres now where people can go and access at least some of that data, again, on a properly anonymised or pseudonymised basis. But that's where just the access to the data that you need in order to do the research properly is primitive in Britain compared with in some other countries. And that's even before you start getting into the fascinating questions about the value of data from social media. And the claims by Google, some of the experts challenge it, the claims by Google that the frequency with which people Google the word cough or Google sore throat is a better predictor of patterns of illness than any medical returns that you get. So even beyond linking up the conventional administrative data, you can see even more exciting prospects opening up. And I would love Britain to be a leader in that. We're not at the moment, but we could be. And then just one or two other observations. I can remember seeing what was perhaps the future of librarianship. And I'd like to conclude with sharing with you what that vision was. And I was given a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. And it was in the form of a tiny speck of material in the bottom of a test tube. At the Bioinformatics Institute outside Cambridge, they had encoded Shakespeare's sonnets in DNA so that you could, with a very simple mechanism, so that you could translate back into English from that tiny speck of material, provided you got a genetic sequencing technology. Now, we've had a lot of technological advances in data storage and retrieval in the past 30 years, and some of them have ended up pretty frustrating. I believe, and we're here at the British Library, and I was an advisor at the time, that the decision was taken on the 900th anniversary of the Doomsday Book to do a modern Doomsday Book, collating all the data that we had about the ownership of land across Britain. And if you come to the British Library, you can still access the 1086 Doomsday Book, but the 1986 modern digital record is now unreadable, I understand, because the technology has moved on and no longer is that dataset easy to access. We have stacks of videos of our kids playing in the garden when they were children, and no means whatsoever in the house of any longer watching those videos. It is incredibly frustrating. And so the challenge is, if you keep on moving from one technology to the next very rapidly, will you find yourself losing access to data? Well, the argument in favour of the genetic database is this is a human universal. DNA is the universal in nature's code for transmitting data, actually. It's how nature sends instructions through biological systems. And any advanced society is going to be able to read genetic code. Now, obviously, there's the disaster scenario where we lose all that knowledge, but to be honest, in that scenario, we lose computers and we lose a hell of a lot of other ways in which we store data as well. But the argument is, any advanced society is going to be reading genetic code. So a technology that transmits man-made data in the same way as the natural world transmits data is the most reliable universal data system we are going to have. And I personally think that is quite a persuasive argument. We can have advances in genetic sequencing technologies. I think they will happen. They're already happening. But whatever the genetic sequencing technology, it's always going to have to be able to read that raw material, those cells containing DNA. So it's a form of data storage which is relatively robust to technological advances. And I think it's just possible that in the decade ahead, it's the form that our research libraries will take. Thank you very much indeed.